Welcome to another episode of the All Turtles podcast, a show about entrepreneurship and AI. I'm John Cifuentes, co-founder at All Turtles. Today, Phil Libin and Jessica Collier interview Max Levchin. Max is a co-founder of PayPal, and he also started HVF Labs and Affirm. He explains how machine learning can be applied to lending decisions. Then, Phil and Jessica present the Advice to Entrepreneurs segment to share wisdom about dealing with competition. They also answer a question about Google's Pentagon contract and a $25 million donation.
And we're joined by Max Levchin, the founder and CEO of Affirm, and founder and important person in lots of previous exploits, which we'll get to in a little bit. Super happy to have you here, Max.
Hi, Max.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming in.
So, Max, you're probably best known originally for PayPal. What are some of the foundational things you did to think about and deal with security, and what could modern companies learn from it?
The good news is that the total number of bad people in the world that want to do bad things to companies and people is fixed. Like, one of the good sort of grounding reminders to oneself is when you're kind of surveying your fraud numbers or your would-be security holes or breaches or all the things that sort of keep CTOs up at night. When I was a CTO at PayPal, so this very much kept me up at night. The one way of kind of like, it's going to be okay is so long as you stem the tide of scalable attacks where one bad person can do many bad things, the rest is going to take care of itself, because if you just have one bad person doing one bad thing, there's not that many bad people in the world. So that's, you don't have to do anything about that. You just kind of maybe sleep a little bit easier. One of the sort of interesting programmatic lessons learned that I've brought with me to everything I've ever done is this idea that computers are really good, at least today, computers are really good at doing repetitive calculations over and over again, and humans are really good at recognizing patterns. And so if you are analyzing behavior or trying to detect bad behavior by bad people, you're going to find that computers are really good at summarizing this behavior, but they're never going to be as good, or again, not today, are going to be as good as humans at saying, oh, that looks fishy. That looks fishy is a toolkit that you need to give a human and then help them optimize the decision-making process down to hopefully very, very little time. But it's really hard to get rid of the human entirely. So the human-computer loop is something that we invented at PayPal and have since brought to every undertaking I've ever done. And I've certainly spent the last 20-odd years basically solving the same problem over and over again. All of this is more fraud and attempt to kind of socially engineer the system or abuse the system. It's not pure security. Pure security is something that you did in your past as well. And that stuff ultimately, use strong crypto, rotate your keys, don't trust one-factor authentication, don't invent your own primitives, don't code your own primitives. Like, all the stuff they teach you, it's for real. Like, one of the sort of funny stories about PayPal is the night before we launched the original PayPal pilot-to-pilot money beaming product, sat down with our crypto advisor. So I built no primitives for PayPal except
Pilot-to-pilot is like Palm Pilot.
Palm Pilot, yeah.
Like blast from the past, like Palm Pilot.
Yeah,
that was the original product.
That. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry.
It's okay.
We were using infrared, fully, by the way, cryptographically secure, signed,
Yeah, when you said pilot-to-pilot beaming, you literally meant all of those words.
Yeah, I totally.
Palm Pilot to Palm Pilot using the infrared beam.
That's right.
That they used to have.
Sorry, I've now dated myself. But that was the original product. And as we set that up, the only piece of cryptographic primitive that I insisted on coding myself, because there wasn't really a good one, was collecting of random data for the seed of the random number generator. So the PRNG was some sort of a stock PRNG, something like Yarrow, but the collection of the random sort of cosmic noise had to be done somehow. And so I asked the user to just scribble across the touch screen of the Palm Pilot with their stylus. And it was a really great idea. I was very proud of it. And right the night before we launched, I sat down with a cryptographic advisor who is now a full professor at Stanford, Dan Bonet, said, hey, just, I glance over my code, see what happens. And as he was glancing, he said, holy crap, do you understand what you did? And so he took me through, yeah, this is not slightly vulnerable. It is, in fact, completely breakable. And he proceeded to blow off his 30th birthday party to help me first fix it, and then verify it, and then verify it again, verify again, verify it again. And his wife would come by every couple hours and say, hey, the friends have gathered. Hey, the friends are now drinking to your, the friends are now eating your cake. The friends have gone home. I'm going home. I hate you.
Right.
And it's like, just 1 second. We need to verify this thing. So don't build your own crypto. But fraud is a more interesting problem because it is fundamentally human versus human with computer help, while security is fundamentally a machine problem.
We have two listeners in the podcast. One of them knows that PRNG is a pseudo-random number generator, and the other one does because I just explained it.
Okay, good.
So can you tell us a little bit about how the kinds of fraud that you dealt with and worked around at PayPal, like how does that apply on a larger scale with the kind of things we're seeing on social media now?
PayPal is fundamentally about transactional fraud. So, and my work at Affirm today kind of repeats some of that, but fundamentally the pattern looks like this. You have a system like PayPal, like Affirm, like Visa, MasterCard that fundamentally creates trust, provides source of good funds, as they call it, where a merchant somewhere says, I have a thing, I'd like to sell it to you. Do you have good funds? Bad guy says, I have good funds. And in some cases, that means I stole your identity and I applied for a loan, or I stole your credit card and I'm just using that, or I have figured out how to get into your Bitcoin wallet and use that. But all of those are kind of that's the preamble. Then you get the item shipped to you by the merchant, and then you sell it on a street corner. And there's sort of a natural degree of fencibility. So reselling a mattress on a street corner is illegal in half the states. And so that's really not a great thing to steal, to acquire this way. Digital goods are almost impossible to resell on street corners because they're digital, but there's typically a liquid market for them. So that's an interesting way. So all of that is fundamentally about just enriching yourself. And the interesting economic question there is, what is the discount rate the bad guy or bad girl is willing to take to basically liquidate? Fundamentally, what they're doing is they're liquidating data. So they stole your identity, stole your password, they stole your Bitcoin, whatever it is, it's just data. And so they're buying data through some level of effort. And sometimes they're just literally buy it on a black market, and then they convert it to a thing that they can sell, and then they get the money. And then the question is, what's the sort of X to Y dollar ratio? And as long as you make the X to Y dollar ratio close enough to, that's not as good as I can get elsewhere, they'll just leave. Like, they're completely rational species. It's not that difficult.
So it's direct enrichment with like usually liquid resources or liquid capital.
And the liquidity is what matters on the on the other side of it. But on stuff that we're seeing on social media, it uses some of the techniques, but it's fundamentally for a very different purpose. And there, this ratio of money in, influence out, really hard to estimate, because if you're trying to influence presidential election, the influence out might be worth so much money, you don't care how many resources you're putting in. And so I think that's part of why a lot of the sort of we've done at PayPal and people like us have done elsewhere are just sort of confused by it, because you have actors, maybe state actors, maybe corporate actors, who don't mind putting in a sort of obscene amounts of resources to achieve some kind of a goal. And this whole notion of, well, let's just make it too expensive for them to, like, let's only sell things that cannot be resold in a street corner and that it's no big deal, doesn't apply. Like, they're not trying to enrich themselves. They're trying to change the world, and not necessarily in a good way. So that's probably the most interesting way of, at least in my mind, of looking at the problem. A lot of the techniques on the way in are the same, though. So stealing identities, stealing wallets, stealing cards, like all of that is kind of the same.
But you don't get to cash out immediately is the interesting piece, right? It's a very indirect benefit.
Well, it's all a question of what's the long game.
Yeah.
But we're now sort of dangerously close to political territory.
We had Renée.
Oh, I love going into political territory. Anyway, go ahead, Phil.
Sorry.
No, please.
We had Renée DiResta on the podcast a few weeks ago, kind of prominent security and social media manipulation researcher. She made a point that a lot of what she's trying to look for are signs of inauthenticity. That it's the inauthentic behavior. It's when you have a Twitter account that starts doing something that doesn't feel like it's an actual authentic, and even though if it's a real person, they're doing it for inauthentic reasons. And I kind of like this idea of inauthenticity and detecting it as like a good marker for things to potentially avoid. What do you think?
Sure, that's exactly right. But the question is, so a human can do that pretty easily. Like, oh, you're starting to use funny words. I've never heard you say discombobulate, and now you're just discombobulated all the time about some political this or that. So, maybe somebody's paying you to say these things, or maybe you're not even you anymore, someone's acting as you. Try teaching a computer that, do you use this word all the time? No, but then again, I learn new words a bunch. And so how do you create a scalable platform to detect and out inauthentic behavior, I think is a fairly open challenge.
Yeah. And when we say inauthentic, we really just mean you don't sound like yourself, not like you sound disingenuous right now, which seem to be different things.
I'm not sure what that means for everyone in the world of stolen identity detection, which I'm very familiar with. The things you look for are patterns of transactions and even patterns of engagement with commerce that appears inauthentic. For example, it is pretty easy to tell that someone who normally just spends money on Amazon and then occasionally ventures out into other e-commerce sites suddenly starts hitting the digital subscriptions of adult nature hard with their credit card may not really be that person. Like that card may have been compromised and so on and so forth. That's fairly easy to detect and the computer can do it. And so velocity control is another way where, I buy 3 things on Amazon every month and 2 of those have to do with cycling. If I suddenly start buying lots and lots and lots of things on Amazon, even if they all have to do with cycling, it's just not like unless I'm starting to open a store or hoarding things, that's
right.
Another way.
So it's just deviations from typical behavior.
But some of it is inauthentic and kind of getting into somewhat political territories. For example, what's being alleged about Russian interference with the NRA, right? Where you had Russian gun rights groups, which the NRA kind of bought, and their leadership was like, yeah, of course there are these people in Russia who are in favor of the right to bear arms, just like we have in the US, and sure, we'll take their money and go over there. And it's just like, for, I think, people who know anything about Russian culture, that's just like inauthentic. You're like, no, there aren't. It's sort of obvious that these Russians who want you to come and speak to them about gun rights must have something else in mind because there's not really a culture of that. How do you protect against that? There was just, apparently there's just no one in NRA leadership that knew much about Russian culture. And yeah, how do you teach that to a computer? I'm just not sure.
Right. It's disingenuous with like the intent of malevolence as opposed to just a deviation from your typical patterns of behavior.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe the weakness there is, maybe the leadership at the NRA that was making these decisions was, had a little bit too much of a narrow view. It was all like the same kinds of people with the same kinds of experience. And when faced with something just outside of their area of expertise, like they just had no idea. They just didn't know that there was literally no one in Russia who would advocate for legitimately and authentically the right for Russian citizens to own private firearms.
That hasn't been a thing there for a while.
Yeah, that's really not a thing. So let's talk about Affirm. You have decided to solve a important problem. I think a scalable, both an injustice and something with a significant economic impact if solved correctly in Affirm. What is it specifically?
So Affirm is, we think, a better way to borrow money. At least that's what it is today. And we built a company around the idea that you should borrow money, or you can borrow money, or people normally borrow money to buy things. And instead of focusing on debt, we should try to help them get credit, which sounds like a little bit of a marketing tagline, but it's deeper than that. So if you look at how consumer credit evolved in this country, especially since kind of the introduction of the credit card, it will strike you as a sort of a bizarre set of injustices, which are really strange because, most things, I'm a big fan of capitalism. Capitalism does a pretty good job resolving kind of weird discontinuities in markets, but not so with consumer credit. So, for example, if you are not of the best credit quality, about half the profits from the banks that lend money to the likes of you will come from late fees. In other words, unpacking that just a little bit more, when the bank tells you, hey, you should be on time because there's a late fee, and that's there to discourage you from, that's a longer word than necessary, to sort of slap your wrist and make sure that you really do pay on time.
Right.
What they're really saying is, well, it's all well and good, but half the profits come from those late fees, so maybe we shouldn't remind you as often, or maybe we should increase the late fees when you least expect them. So that's kind of one example of where things went. And you can trace it back very easily to some enterprising bank executives that said, well, hey, so when I increase my late fee amount from $5 to $50, it's 100% gross margin increase. Like that, it doesn't cost me anything to charge you more, so I will. And so they have one of those kind of and that's actually that's like the least egregious. The more kind of obscene, the stuff that I just rattled off it's like amoral. Like, you can make more money, so you do. Capitalism, yay. The next example is like truly immoral, and I think it's probably just evil, where there's this famous product, very, very profitable, called deferred interest, where you are offered a 0% loan. And in very small print, it says, by the way, if you're not exactly on time with a payment schedule, and the payment schedule goes for these days as long as 12 years. So you have 144 months to be slightly late, so a dollar short or an hour late. The interest rate will go from 0 to 29% or some hefty number. But instead of kind of like, okay, the honeymoon's over, man, 0% goes away, 29% from now on, actually 29% from the time of purchase. So in the worst case scenario, you have 29% APR compounding year to year to year, typically on a nightly basis for 12 years. It's an easy way of finding yourself not just broke, but sort of in a permanent state of debt. And this is not like a thing that really sort of poor people are faced with. This is available to you if you go to, a department store where they'll offer you a credit card that's issued at the point of sale. And these products are evil. They occasionally get banned by Congress, and then enterprising lobbies on both the retail side and credit card side figure out a way to unban it somehow. And you can literally see it in like, it's not okay. Footnote says, actually, if it's for credit cards, it's fine. So it's a long-winded rant about the wrongs of the industry. We set out to build a card replacement, credit replacement product that would be honest and transparent and not charge fees of this type or any type. In fact, we don't charge late fees, don't charge deferred interest, don't charge anything but here's a principal, here's what the ultimate loan will cost you, here's how many months it'll take, and that's it. And it was almost this naive that we launched with and said, hey, if you're buying something, we'll convince the merchant to offer us alongside credit cards and see what happens. And we're now in thousands of merchants and have millions of customers and have made billions of dollars of loans. So it's a thing. There's a whole generation of people who are shopping using Affirm, primarily because of the clarity and the sense of control that you get, because you cannot revolve, you cannot be in debt past the time that the loan is due. So it's a little bit of social injustice, a little bit of a capitalism mixed together, and so far so good. It's been 7 years, so it took a while to get going. Yeah.
Did you get pushback initially from people asking you how you would incentivize customers to pay if you weren't charging late fees?
Yeah, we still do. I think it's still a topic. And by the way, there's a percentage of people so we have extremely high Net Promoter Scores. Our Net Promoter Score is 83. For comparison, Amex, which also is a pretty nice financial brand, is in the 50s. A typical credit card bank that offers you a card at the point of sale is in the negative. So people will actively tell their friends, don't touch that stuff. That's just nasty.
Well, it's essentially predatory lending, as you described it.
Yeah. The interesting thing is actually just one more bit of soapbox. The difference between payday lending and credit cards is de minimis. The only thing that changes is the annual rate. But the reason payday lending is so nasty is exactly the same reason credit cards are generally bad for you. They allow you both to refinance your debt. If you look at a payday loan and say, it's $100 and I need to bring it back to you next week and I need to give you $50 more in interest. If that's all you could do, it's a lot on a rate side, but that's not the end of the world. But when you come in and say, I'm still short, they say, no problem. Just next week, bring me 100. And then a year later, you find yourself bankrupt. So same is true of credit cards, except there they encourage you to do this. Say, the minimum payment is $25. Just, don't worry. Just keep revolving. So anyway, on the disincentive to be late, there's basically 4 groups of people. One is free riders, people that say, I've used this before. They don't really charge me late fees. It's cool. I'll be late by a couple of days. We send them a bunch of emails and a bunch of texts, and we contact them through any form of channel possible. And we have a fairly small, we think, population of free riders, but they exist. And if I could find a way to slap their wrist and tell them, like, come on, be a responsible adult, I would. That's the one good use case for late fees. The problem is the other 3 groups are people that defrauded us, that said, I have no intention of paying you back ever. Telling them, well, late fee for you is like saying, shaking your fist in the wind. Like, they're not going to pay you anyway. So we screwed up long ago. Like, this is not the time to settle that one. The other 2 groups are people that lied to themselves, where they said, you know what? I'm going to be on time because I'm going to win the lottery and I'm going to get that new job and it's going to be great. That's also our fault. Like, we should have figured out what's going on there by looking at their financial data, looking at their credit history, whatever it is, because they don't really have the money. They just kind of invented this use case that shouldn't have existed. The last group is the group that is primarily, I think, responsible for a net promoter score. These are the people that had the money, had the intention, had all the things going right for them, and then their dog got hit by a car, or they had a medical emergency, or something happened. When they call us,
the government shut down, and
the government shut down. So when the government shut down, we told all of our government-employed, temporarily jobless borrowers that they basically have as long as they need to figure it out, because we knew that telling them, hey, you're late. Like, what are they going to do? They have no cash flow.
Did anyone else do this? Like, did any of the major credit cards just be like, hey, don't worry about it?
I have not seen anyone, doesn't mean that they didn't do it, but I've not seen any major issuers do it, except I do take a little bit of pride. PayPal did the same thing. So PayPal and Affirm, with no coordination, I have nothing to do with PayPal these days for sure, both announced that we are doing this thing. There's definitely been calls for it. So you've seen people say, hey, maybe lenders should do something about this. And we started working on our program basically the second the government shut down. But PayPal, I think, did the right thing as well. PayPal actually created a pool of capital to do cash advances for government workers, which I thought was even cooler. We just basically said, look, we will be flexible with loan terms. But the person who calls us and says, hey, my dog died and I know I'm late, I'm going to pay you, what's the late fee? And our customer service agent says, oh, there is no late fee. Just get current when you can. The light bulb goes off and you're like, holy crap, I have to tell my friends about you. And that's the net promoter score that we enjoy. And the fact that our growth has been so strong is largely driven by people that expect the financial industry to screw them and are delighted by the fact that we don't.
Which is kind of an amazing thing, right? You basically said, what if we build a model for giving people loans where the model is we want people to pay them back. We want people to pay the loans back on time, and we're going to build a business that assumes that we're going to give money to people that are going to pay it back on time, which is, it turns out, not how existing loans work. Like credit cards give you, in effect, loans when they kind of want you to be late.
Yes. One of the most interesting minutia from sort of the PayPal years, if you're never revolving on your credit card, the issuing banks generally have a nickname for you called the deadbeat, which of course is completely upside down.
Yeah.
But yeah, kind of remarkable. But it turns out, maybe the insight that I had about fraudsters from all those years ago has taught me something where most people are actually pretty good. They're not trying to steal money. They're not trying to take advantage of the system. They kind of want to borrow some money because they need it, and they want to pay it back mostly on time if they can. So assuming those two things built us a nice business.
I think that's an interesting point. Like, I haven't kept a balance on a credit card in years. I was just, I guess, I don't know, immigrant parents, like the way it was brought up. It's like you don't keep a balance on your credit card. It's an obviously bad thing to do. And so, yeah, I've had a credit card for a long time, but the banks probably don't like me very much because they don't make any money off of me on this.
But that's why they invented things like annual fees, because that's one way to charge you, or the other way is they charge merchants to process the cards. But there's definitely most money to be made if you ever decide to carry a balance.
Great. Max, thanks so much for being here today.
Yeah, thanks for
Pleasure.
coming in. It was
Thank
great
you.
talking to you. It's time for our Advice to Entrepreneurs segment. Today, we're going to talk about something every company faces, regardless of size, and that's competition. Phil, I think you have opinions on this. How should startups deal with competition?
I do have opinions on this.
No way.
Yeah, it's a super common thing, me having opinions, it turns out.
Yeah. I mean, we've made an entire video series out of your opinions.
I think competition is the kind of thing that we get asked about a lot. And most pitch decks that we see that have things about competitions, investors ask about competition a lot. And I've never really had a good answer. Like when when I'm running companies, people ask about competition, my answer is always like, I don't really know.
Your answer is always ignore them. Who cares? Yeah,
basically, which I think is kind of like the shortcut answer is like, it doesn't really matter. And a little bit more specifically, we've got this rock, paper, scissors model of threat, which is a slightly more nuanced answer, which basically little startups, like raw, fresh startups, are like scissors.
Mm.
They're fast. They're sharp. They can kind of jut in and out and cut things. Recently successful, like medium-sized startups, are rocks, and big companies are paper. And the threat model works the way that you expect, meaning like if you are a small startup, you're a scissor, you have nothing to fear from big companies. Because they're too slow. Like big companies aren't your competition; they're your target. You can steal their customers, you can poach their best employees, you can disrupt their business, you can innovate. Like the big companies, if you're a small, quickly moving startup, you're not competing with them. You're like they are your target. They are your source of talent and revenue and customers.
But how do you deal with just having infinitely less cash than big companies?
By just making your decisions and your execution much faster than they can, right? Because like big companies, like they can't do anything different in less than a couple of years' time, and as a startup, you can. So they can't move quickly enough to be a threat to you. And at the same time, if you're a scissor, other scissors don't matter. So competition from other startups is also irrelevant because they don't have the market share. If there's 50 startups chasing the same idea, it doesn't actually matter who the best one is. What matters is like which are the ones that are good enough, that solve the problem well enough. And you're not going to lose because some other startup beats you. You're going to lose if you haven't actually solved the problem like correctly. And if you do, and 3 other startups do, then great. Then all 3 of you kind of go on to the next level. So most of the competition that startups know about, which is either other startups because they all hang out at the same incubators or Y Combinator or whatever. And so they're just like, they read TechCrunch, and so they know what other startups are doing and they worry about it. It's like, that's irrelevant. It doesn't matter what other startups are doing. And it doesn't matter what big companies are doing because they're too slow to be a threat. It does matter what the rocks are doing. And the rocks are companies that used to be startups, but that like have in the past couple of years become, medium-sized and succeeded because they've actually solved the problem well.
So maybe an example of 2 companies that used to be scissors that were solving the same problem, but those both did it pretty well. And so now they've moved on to being rocks, like Uber and Lyft.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so when Uber and Lyft got started, it didn't really matter. Their competition wasn't other startups. There's a bunch of these like ride-sharing companies that started roughly the same time because basically that's when smartphones and GPS became available. And their competition, it turns out, wasn't really like taxi companies because those were way too slow. They hadn't changed anything. And there were no rocks. Like this is actually a good example. Like they started at a time where all the competition was paper. There hadn't been innovation in decades. There were no rocks. But a couple of years after Uber and Lyft became Uber and Lyft, and like right now, it's a pretty bad time to start a ride-sharing company.
Right.
Because Uber and Lyft aren't dumb, slow-moving companies yet.
The rock will crush your scissors.
Yeah, and they'll move pretty fast. And when they move like with force. They move with millions of customers. Evernote was a similar example. Like when we started Evernote, when we were first launched the first modern version of Evernote in like 2008, there were no rocks in the space. Like the productivity space was all paper. It was Microsoft Office. It hadn't changed in 30 years. It was way too slow. We were a small, fast-moving company. There were lots of other startups. There was lots of other like note-taking startups, though they didn't matter either. We did well enough, as did a few others, to kind of get into that rock phase, and then Evernote became a rock. And that's actually when all of the, Evernote competitor startups kind of sprang up. But that was a bad idea because like by the time we were like recently successful, like we're not slow yet. So if you're a rock and you see a really great idea from a new startup, you can just copy that idea, or you can just like buy the startup, or but whatever you do with like more force, almost as quickly as a scissor, but with more impact.
Right.
But when you're a rock, you are threatened by the big companies, just like Evernote really did become threatened by Microsoft, but only when we got to be medium-sized, because by the time you're a medium-sized company, you're a rock, you are actually going after the same customers as paper. And paper, like they've got more lawyers and they've got more contracts and they can kind of undercut your price and they can do like all sorts of things.
Right. They can fight you legally until you expire.
Legally and in the market in many other ways. And then when you become a big company, you're not threatened by the medium ones, but you are threatened by the raw startups because they can disrupt you. So this is the rock paper model of competition. So like the short answer about like what's your competition, if you're a startup, is, doesn't really matter. You can just ignore them. Really, what that means is you should ignore them if they're other scissors or they're paper, and you shouldn't have started your startup if there were rocks.
So in the Uber and Lyft example, what are the paper companies that could cover those particular rocks?
Well, I mean, I think right now, so they would have been the paper companies at that point would have been like the rental car companies. It would have been like Hertz and Avis, and they were like way too slow.
Mm-hmm.
And at this point, like they're all much smaller than Uber. So like Uber, I think at this point is probably becoming the paper company, and maybe being ripe for disruption again. But it's probably a little bit too soon. Like it takes a couple of decades for a company. Like companies rarely get slow and stupid within the first few years. Even if they get really big, they tend to preserve at least some of the move fast culture. But a decade later. So like the ideal time to start a raw startup is when there hasn't been innovation in a couple of decades and all of the competition are giant established companies. Like if you're competing against IBM, like, yeah, great, fantastic. If you're competing against Oracle. But if there are things that are recently successful, that's a bad area to be in. And that's the mistake everyone makes, because most startup founders and most investors, like the way they get the idea in their head to make something is because they see that someone just made $1 billion doing that thing. Someone is like, oh, there's this thing called Evernote and they actually just did really well. We can do that too. You're like, right, exactly. But the fact that Evernote only did it a couple of years ago is why you shouldn't do it now, because like it's not like it's a rock at this point. So like the thing that makes people try to copy recently successful ideas is, I think, the wrong motivation, and is what leads people into trouble. So competition, yeah, if it's another startup, it doesn't matter. If it's a big company, it doesn't matter. And if it's a recently successful, medium-sized rock, then it matters, but you've already made the mistake by starting a startup where there are rocks present. That's my opinion.
Always good to hear your opinion. So now it's time for one of our favorite things, a listener question. This came in from Steve via email. I saw an article that Google is giving away $25 million to fund humane AI projects to solve seemingly intractable problems. My question to the Alternative Luminaries is what they think of this effort, which coincides with Google's decision to not pursue $10 billion military contract for use of AI, which Microsoft is now pursuing.
We're luminaries.
Yeah, I know. Only in our own minds.
Yeah. I think that listener was being sarcastic.
Yes, I think they were. But I also think like the difference between the two amounts of money that are in this question is just like mind-boggling. Right? So they decide not to pursue a $10 billion military contract and then to give away $25 million for, quote, humane AI projects.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny that like the difference is like when I first read this question, I was like, why would anyone criticize Google for giving away $25 billion? Oh, wait.
Right. Yeah. It's a very easy, like, good guy win. I don't know. How do you feel? I feel like you probably have very strong opinions about this, but I do too, which are that, like, I don't actually think that a company whose, public-facing ethos has always been something about not being evil, yada, 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 should be providing like technology to the military.
Well, so I think this is sort of two questions, right? There's like they're giving away $25 million to fund humane AI projects, which I think is great. And you can argue that it's like insufficient, but like I think that's a little bit.
Well, you can argue that it's a drop in the bucket.
Sure, but like,
yeah.
But I'm not going to criticize Google for giving away $25 million for like to fund worthwhile hard problems. Like, great, and maybe they'll ratchet it up to it.
I think we could say you can like honestly say that you could probably fund like one good humane AI project with $25 million. But let's not get it twisted. You're not going to fund a whole bunch of them.
Well, I mean, we've raised, up to now, we've raised $20 million at All Turtles and, haven't spent all of it. And I think got a few decent projects underway. But yeah, look, like it doesn't seem, mind-bogglingly generous, but it's a good start. And I really I think like people who criticize, charity as being insufficient or like not, I don't know, it doesn't feel right to me. So I'm happy Google is doing it. Hopefully they'll do more. And I think we should encourage this kind of behavior in companies. And
well, what do you think of Google and Microsoft doing things like pursuing military contracts? That's the piece that I think that is more important.
Yeah, that's a I don't know. I have mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, I think it's very dangerous to equate military with like evil. Like this is a slope that doesn't like lead to a good place. I don't think that, you know, the U.S. military, or really the military of most countries, is bad. And I think the association that just because it's a military contract there's something immoral about it is a dangerous association. I think like I would rather have the military be something that like we as a democracy agree is virtuous, is necessary.
I think most people would agree that it's theoretically virtuous and necessary, but that in practice it often ends up doing immoral things.
Yeah, but I think the work is to like make it in practice as well. And I don't know that distancing yourself from actually working on it kind of helps with that. So like I understand the instinct, but it troubles me that someone would be like, oh, it's for the military, therefore I'm not going to do it. On the other hand, I understand that instinct. So I'm not sure. Is morality served by having a, you know, less competent and maybe more expensive company? I'm not saying that Microsoft is either of those things compared to Google, but like in general, if you're going to move away from something, you know, someone else is going to do it. The flip side is also like, what exactly is it? There's probably certain things that maybe you don't work on and certain things that you do, you know, like maybe, you know, if I personally, and I can only speak in the first person for myself, but like if I was given a contract to develop bombs, I wouldn't, just because not necessarily saying that bombs are evil. They're probably serve some kind of purpose in the larger scheme of things that we as a democracy say, but I would feel really bad about working on things that are directly there to kill people.
Well, I think that's how the question is framing it, right? Because Google is giving away $25 million for, quote, humane AI projects.
Yeah.
Which means that, like, really what we're saying isn't that the military is necessarily evil, but that they participate in a lot of activities that are inhumane, including killing a lot of people with bombs.
But I think the reality is they also participate in a lot of activities that prevent a lot of people from getting killed, that are probably quite humane. And I know this is super complicated with, you know, the drone program and you know, we're not going to solve that answer. So like I generally try to like avoid my own knee-jerk reaction of saying military stuff is something to be avoided, because I think if we do that, we really will have othered the military, and then they really will become kind of unchecked and unmoored from democracy and less virtuous. So I kind of favor engagement in this front. So I would rather companies like Google take the contracts and then try to make them virtuous than move away from them.
But do you think that taking a contract like that gives you the room to be virtuous or humane? Right? My
Hopefully.
But why? Like, why would that be the case? Well, given everything that we know about, you know, how bureaucracy functions, like you're a skeptic of government.
Yeah, I mean, certainly like staying away from it doesn't give you, like, that maybe gives you the purity of saying it wasn't involved, but it also means you're not shaping the actual development and how they spend that money.
It always ends up being a question of like whether it's easier to try to change the system from within, and like therefore the goal is to like get yourself in the room, or whether it's more important to work outside the system.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And I think that my personal judgment there is like, if it's an irredeemably broken and evil and like malevolent system, then I would not try to change it from within. I would not want to be part of it. I do not perceive, for the record, the U.S. military as being anything close to being irredeemably evil and malevolent and corrupt. So like, I actually think that is a system that is worth trying to engage with and improve. But that's not the case like for everything. There's plenty of things that I think are just, the world is much better. I don't think the world is better off without a U.S. military. So I would probably err on the side of engagement and trying to reform it from within or improve it from within. But I understand the instinct of people wanting to push back against that.
Well, thanks, Steve, for sending us this very nuanced question so that we can argue about it for a while.
Thank you, Steve.
This podcast is a production of the All Turtles Worldwide Media Empire. We recorded this episode in the world-class Donatello Studios in San Francisco, California. Thanks to Max Levchin for joining us this episode. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes, send us an email to hello@all-turtles.com. Marie reads every message. Thanks to everyone who made this episode possible, including Jim Metzendorf for editing, Marie McCoy-Thompson for production supervision and editorial management, Chris Plug for his audio expertise, Micah Rivera for our artwork, and Matt Ammerman for our theme music. On behalf of Jessica Collier, Phil Libin, and yours truly, John Cifuentes, and the rest of the All Turtles team, thanks for listening.